Hey, I'm Duke on Twitch. If you want to support the channel and GreenSunsZenith.com, you can find my Patreon, merch store, and singles store where you can buy singles through TCG Player or CardHoarder in the video description. If you want to get in contact, you can also find all that info in the description below for things like donation deck lists or just wanting to reach out. Alright, let's get right into it.
Hey, welcome back to Dukes on Twitch. Back today with just a bit of a deck tech on Green-White Depths, some of the lists that have been doing really well recently, and yeah, just with obviously a few big tournaments coming up, such as Eternal Weekend in North America, Europe, or Japan, and then also just things like Buffalo Chicken Dip Legacy events running around. I think it's really interesting to look into some of the green decks that are performing pretty well right now, obviously in a pretty blue-black heavy metagame. It is nice to see players who are taking on that challenge of playing sort of a green deck in this format and doing pretty well with it. So on the previous weekend, we just had Super Cow 12653 came fourth with a 6-2 finish with a green-white depths build, which is really cool to see. And as a Maverick player, there's even a bonus to it in that it plays 16 creatures, which is pretty far from what we've seen previously. Typically, we're seeing around the 10 to 12 figure, mostly 12, with if you say 4 Knight, 4 Elvish Reclaimer, and then you have your Dryad Arbor, your Safekeeper. So in this instance, we're seeing Keen-Eyed Curator and typically 2 more Endurance than what you typically see in a green-white build. And obviously for Cow, it's been doing really well. If you look at their past results with the deck, it's been the same 75, which I think shows that this player has really put together a list that they find works, because the deck is pretty heavy on true ability. You have 4 GreenSunsZenith, 4 Crop Rotation, Reclaimers, Knights. So the deck naturally has that flexibility of having one of creatures or lands that you might want to search for in specific matchups. So for the deck and for Super Cow to find a list that they've kept and done really well with it in multiple challenges and lists and in leagues, I should say, I think that's really cool. And that's a really good sign of the strength of the deck that they've put together. So obviously a huge shout out to Super Cow, whoever you are. But I just want to go after some of the choices. And I think that, you know, including cards like Keen-Eyed Curator, which don't really do anything to the initial plan of the deck. I would say your typical plan A for this deck is to assemble Thespian Stage and Dark Depths to create Marilasian Creator 2020. Your plan B is probably going to be beats with a large Knight of the Reliquary or cards like a 3/4 Reclaimer. And then your plan C is probably a win through some sort of lock. So maybe you have Ramanap in Wasteland. Maybe your opponent went off and you had the Bajuka Bog. Plan C is probably more so the disruption part of the deck. So Keen-Eyed kind of fits into plan B and C somewhat. Obviously, you can get pretty big as well. So yeah, pretty sweet to see Keen-Eyed Curator in the list. Scavenging Ooze, while it was kind of in the format before Keen-Eyed kind of came in and took over its spot from most decks, it didn't really see play in here either. I think more players would move towards more endurance copies than the first copy of Scavenging Ooze. So I think, especially for a player who's obviously very well versed with depths, to be playing Keen-Eyed Curator, which doesn't really fit with the depth strategy, shows that A, is obviously needed quite heavily right now in the metagame, as in Graveyard Hate, and then B is just a really powerful spell. So I think that's really cool to take note of. And then we have the 3 endurances. So most lists would run the 1, some lists might run 2, but I think when you have 3 or more, then you're saying that I really need to have some sort of force of will effect in a way against decks that go off early on with a graveyard. Probably not so much Oops, because they do have lines to play around endurance, but probably more so the sort of Entomb Reanimate lines that you're seeing out of blue-black. So yeah, as a creature player, as a creature lover, I think that this is probably a list that I will just take the straight 75 for and play it locally, because even the board looks quite open to any sort of metagame. that I think that if I don't target my specific metagame straight away, the sideboard should have answers for most things. We also see through Once Upon a Time, which I would say is becoming more stock. Obviously, as you build up your deck with not cantrips, but very similar effects in things like Green Suns, Crop Rotation once, you are taking away spots of potentially creatures you could have in the list or extra lands. So there is definitely an opportunity cost of running once, but I do really like it in depths. I think it has strong power in that it can find both the creatures that you care about and the lands you care about. So it does kind of work on both axes for you, which is great. And yeah, things we don't see in this list specifically is Sylvan Library or Life in the Loam, which might go in that slot. But yeah, obviously the Super Cow has found it to be pretty great. They are playing a Besage Who Endures as well, which is a card that's obviously very powerful. It does make sense to run it in your green decks. The one thing this deck doesn't have is a Sylvan Scrying effect, where you're able to search up this card, or this land, I should say, and actually put it into your hand, because cards like Elvish Reclaimer, Another Reliquary, Ramanap, Crop Rotation all put it into play, which it's a green source, which is great, but you really want to be able to draw it. So that's another advantage of Once Upon a Time, is that you can try to dig for this card if you do need to find some way to deal with what this card can deal with. So it's always interesting to see Boseiju in these sort of lists, especially when you don't have like even a loam to get it back into your hand. If you've, pitched it to a Mox Diamond or got rid of it another way. But yeah, obviously it's just nice to have that flexibility of, it is a green source, it is a card I can pitch to Mox Diamond, but it also just has this added ability to potentially disrupt what my opponent's doing. So I really like that. I think the 2 depths and 3 stage mix is pretty typical these days. I think this really goes to show how strong the plan B of the deck is, in that we don't rely on Dark Depths in a way that you have to run 4 and 4. And I think that's where it has that slight advantage over a deck like Lands, which is going to win most of its games through Dark Depths or Urza's Saga as its plan B. It doesn't have the ability to go too big like we can with another Reliquary or similar creatures. So I think that's, pretty stock. Echoing Deeps is a card that I've really enjoyed playing with. I think it's fantastic with Crop Rotation, especially when you're getting rid of a card that you want to copy. So if you've already played your Bojuka Bog out and your opponent doesn't think you have another way to interact with their graveyard, if they then try to go off, you can of course sacrifice the Bojuka Bog to a Crop Rotation, get Echoing Deeps, and then copy that Bojuka Bog. So that's a pretty sweet line that comes up every now and then. And this card also doesn't need to copy. It can just come in as an untapped colorless land, which I only picked up in a league a few months back because someone in chat pointed it out. We really needed to play around Days, and I had the Echoing Deeps as a land to play, and I didn't realize that you could just play it, not copy, and then we were able to play around Days, which is really cool. 2 Flagstones. Flagstones is obviously pretty powerful in this list with cards like Elvish Reclaimer or Crop Rotation, especially with Crop Rotation, making it a lot better against the blue decks where it's not a straight up 2-for-1 if they say counterspell or daze it. And it's a little bit better against Force of Will, where you're going to at least not throw away a land just to casting the Crop Rotation. You are, in most cases, going to be able to find a land off the Flagstones that you get rid of. Flagstones can also do some pretty cool things, like if you really need your planes, you can copy Flagstones with Thespian Stage to have 2 legendary lands in play and then get rid of the Flagstones. You'd want to keep the Stage version because of flexibility, but that allows you to get the planes. Or in this version, you might want to get the Lush Portigo to have a real look at what sort of comes out on top of your deck if you're looking for something specific. Flagstones is, a pretty sweet card. The 1 Forest and 1 Plains, I think that's pretty key. One thing I will say about 2 Flagstones is that I actually cut back on a Flagstones with a copy of Echoing Deeps in the list as just a way to try to figure out how could I open up more slots within the deck. But I do really like that Super Cow's gone with the 2, and obviously has been with 2 for a long time, because it is just really powerful. It does a few different things that we just discussed. That gives you a little bit of an advantage, a little bit of ramp. So I can definitely see why you wouldn't want to cut on Flagstones in this sort of list. The Caracas, pretty key. Sometimes you see the Dark Depths lists running the Caracas in the board, but I think right now it's just worth having. It's not the greatest against Tamiyo, but it can disrupt them at times. Obviously, if they play Tamiyo turn 1 and then you just Caracas it, they could replay it and then brainstorm straight away to play around it untapping. But I think that Caracas is just still pretty strong, that it has a place in the main deck. There's nothing in the main deck that we can actually protect with Caracas. We have Gadok Teague in the sideboard. Maybe you want to save that from a Swords to Plowshares postboard against like a blue-white sort of control deck. But I think otherwise, Caracas is mainly there for Traxa if it's a blocker. Not typically the best if you have to return it to their hand otherwise, but sometimes that's all you really can do. Thalia doesn't see too much play. That's probably the card that I think about the most with Caracas. Obviously, Tamiyo can be interesting, especially if you get the choke down and you're able to Caracas the Tamiyo. That's always kind of nice. So there's definitely some small things there, but the more I talk about it, the more I could definitely see Caracas just being a sideboard card. But who knows? 2 Savannah, I think 2 Savannah with the Lush and then the Plains and then the Forest is great for your actual mana. Jury Step, I think, is still just a fantastic card, especially alongside Talon Gates. There's definitely advantages to both. Jury Step is great when your opponent has multiple blockers of the same color. So say your opponent has a Murktide and a Brazen Borrower, then Talon Gates can obviously only get rid of one, whereas Sajiri Step can get you straight through. Talon Gates also, if you do want to save your Marit Lage from some sort of removal spell, it will, of course, take it away for the turn, whereas Sajiri Step just allows you to keep trying to attack and get through. But Talon Gates can also be used defensively. There are times where I'll play my creature out against, say, a Sorcery Speedish style blue-white deck, and then just Talon Gates it away so they can't Teferi Bounce or Supreme Verdict or Prismatic Ending during their turn, and it just comes back on my turn, which is cool. But obviously, yeah, you can get rid of opponents' creatures. The instant speed ability as well is pretty sweet and comes up a lot. And if you are splashing a color, the ability to filter through Talon Gates as well is incredibly useful. So I think Talon Gates is a mainstay at this point in depths. I think it's the deck that probably takes the most advantage of it in Legacy, although there aren't too many other decks that do play. 3 Wasteland. We obviously have the Ramanap in this deck, so that kind of acts as a 4th. But not much to say there. This deck doesn't really go after mana otherwise outside of Choke, so it isn't a full mana denial deck, but it obviously is nice to have access to ways to deal with, say, an opposing Krakus or Maze of Ith, or break up an opposing combination of cards like Dark Depths and Thespian Stage. So Wasteland's always pretty strong. You also have things like Wasteland yourself to grow a Knight or a Reclaimer or get out of Price of Progress, etc. So there's a lot of uses of Wasteland that aren't just kind of seen there on the surface. It also taps for a mana, which sounds basic, but I remember I went to an event and just as a bit of a test, I asked everyone that I met, what does Wasteland do? And all of them just said, oh, you can use it to destroy the non-basic lands. None of them mentioned that it taps for a mana, which I think is pretty interesting because in some matchups, it is just Lotus Petal for you. You do want to be able to play it to play around days, and then they might just Wasteland it, so they can keep, say, their Volk. But yeah, just really interesting that Wasteland isn't always seen as a mana source. Windswept Heath and Yavimaya to cut it out. 4 Yav is pretty stock. Some people add the 5th fetch land, which I typically like in a Bolt metagame, as it's just an extra way to be able to build Reclaimers up to 3/4s early on. But yeah, I think the 4 Ether are pretty stock at this point. Really, I mean, it's a green-white deck. Not much more to say. And then Yav is pretty cool. Yav, of course, allows you to go off naturally on turn 3 to swing turn 4, just by playing Yav into Dark Depths into Stage. There's also some pretty cool crop rotation tricks you can do with it, where you float the mana with Dark Depths and play with Yav, and then go and fetch up Stage. There isn't too much Submerge around, which is quite nice, but it is something to think about. It can be a little bit awkward as well if you're trying to keep your opponent off green and then you just draw the Yav, which you might feel like you need to play, but typically it's just so good for us. We do have a fair amount of non-colored cards in the list, or at least non-green. So there are a lot of hands where you'll have a non-green start hand, which can be pretty brutal. So the Yav can really help with that if you have it in your opening. To the sideboard, a pretty good mix of cards. You can obviously see a pretty heavy combo hate here with things like Forfaria Macabre for obviously graveyard decks, Force of Vigor for a lot of the fast sort of Mystic Forge decks, lands. I don't mind against any sort of Chromox lists, mono red. Deafening Silence, I think is just the best combo hate because it is 1 mana. You might see Dampening Sphere in a few other lists, but I think just that ability to, okay, I untapped, I didn't lose on my, turn 0. I get to play this Deafening Silence and just build out my hate. I think you can't rely on Deafening Silence. I would say it's more of a speed bump for a lot of decks than a stop sign. But I do think that pretty good at what it does. Veil, blue-black is so big. One thing to note is that if you Veil in response to the Archon trigger, they won't draw a card because I believe all targets are now fizzled. So that's pretty interesting. It just means that they get the creature in play. Still pretty bad, but buys you time. Oof and Teague, I think it is great GreenSunsZenith targets. I've seen some lists that main deck either Teague or Oof. Usually the Teague, because Oof does turn off the Mox Diamonds. Teague does stop GreenSuns, but you have Karakas if you really want to sort of do like, against a Cradle deck, you might want to have the Teague out during their turn and then end step Karakas it back to your hand and then do your GreenSuns and then play your Teague again. Typically doesn't come up, but small thing. And then Choke. Choke is always an interesting card to see. I love Choke, and I do play Choke a bit, but it's always tough to really capitalize on it because typically against the decks like blue-black or the 4-color control decks, I like to try to wasteland them when I get the chance, but then sometimes you're wastelanding them off their blue sources first, and then by the time you get Choked down, they kind of just have the other jewels out. But I think it's typically a card that it can really put a pain point on your opponent to get out of, which I do like. So really cool to see Super Cow do well with this list. And I think, honestly, I'll just change my list to be this for my locals because although we don't have too much blue-black in combo decks, it is a pretty nice sideboard for what I typically run into. Again, that consistency of just the same deck is also really cool. So big shout out to them. And then Sol, also within the most recent Legacy Challenge, came 6th in the same one. So probably a more traditional build when it came to the creatures. Here we actually have no Ramanap Excavator. We have Life in the Loams instead. And we have no Outland Liberator, which I think was in this list. Yeah, which I would say is probably more of the stock creatures that you see. You'll usually see the Safekeeper, the Liberator, the Reclaimer, the Endurance, and the Ramanap as like the 4. So usually around 13 creatures, I guess. Really cool to see that, this sort of list did well as well. We don't have any copies of Once Upon a Time, but we do have copies of Sylvan Library, Books, one of my favorite cards of all time, and then 2 Life in the Loams. So 2 and 2 split is really nice, especially with Mox Diamond. They're 2 of your best starts, and I think that although Sylvan Library does open you up to cards that you don't typically care about, like Orcish Bowmaster, it's probably not enough for your opponents to keep the Bowmasters in the decks games 2 and 3. Sylvan Library is also a May trigger, so if they try to Bowmaster you in upkeep, you just don't have to use the Sylvan Library. And sometimes it's just a backbreaking card. There are definitely games where, in matchups where you aren't too scared about Bolt, being at essentially 20 or 2 doesn't really matter. So I'll be pretty aggressive with Sylvan Library in most of my matchups. And it's just a great way to keep on top of your card advantage. So big fan of Library. Quick Reflexes is a really interesting card because it does a few things. It can be a fizzle effect for your opponent's removal. It can be a removal that you use on your opponent's creatures by using your own. It does a ton of things. I know Sam won with Infect in a European event, and I think they were running 4 versions in their Infect list, where it just makes sense, of course, because if it comes to your turn, you have an Infect creature in play that can't really do anything. You're kind of just dead, so. But one card here that is a little bit different, I will say, like Prismatic Ending, I think just the flexibility is nice. I would say this is a little bit of a respect towards cards like Tameo, which can be pretty brutal. it can also hit things like Grafdigger's Cage, which are pretty well positioned right now. So it's always nice to have access to the ending, especially with library, because if you need it, you can find it. If you don't, you can just get it, shuffle it away. So I typically really like to see ending as the 5th copy of Swords to Plowshares as just placeable removal. Loam is obviously a little bit harder to get because compared to Ramanap, you can't GreenSunsZenith for it, which is pretty huge. But I would say that Loam, from like a power level stance, I've had a few players who just concede to Loam on a few different boards, whereas Ramanap is open to creature hate, which is a thing. Fatal Push is pretty rampant right now. But, Mox Diamond land, loan back your land is a pretty great feeling. Especially when you already have a threat in play as well. You're probably more open to dredging the following turn and just trying to get that card advantage going. But Loam kind of runs into this next card, Lava Spur Boots, which can obviously be found with Urza's Saga, which is a fantastic card to have in a Life in the Loam deck. And I think does add a lot to this sort of build because it does a few subtle things. It gives you another way to win through the plan B of just beat down. It allows you to have tokens, which I've seen a lot of Sheoldred's Edict against Loam decks with Marit Lage as the win con. So having extra tokens gives you some play around that, which is great because they obviously make you sacrifice a token creature. It can just win on its own. Like I've definitely had matches where it's like, I'm not going to cast anything. I'm just going to keep this saga going. And I think that if you're going to have one card in the deck that makes the most sense, Lava Spur Boots is just it. You could play around with things like Shadow Spear, Soul Guide Lantern, Haywire Might, Piercing Needle, a ton of things. But I think Boots is really nice. It's just a small package to have for Saga. One thing to note with Saga as well, that's kind of cool, is that as this Saga enters and after your draw step at a lore counter. So if you are kind of mid-game, you want to get a Saga online, you might have a Crop Rotation or a Knight of the Reliquary in play. You draw your card for turn, you assess your board, you assess your hand, what your turn's going to look like. And then still at the end of your draw step, you can use the Knight or the Crop Rotation to get an untapped Urza's Saga. You can then get a counter on it, it comes into play, and then you go to your first main phase and the Saga will trigger again, which does two things. It allows you to have a construct token straight away, most likely. And then the following turn, you get to search. So if you need a blocker that for some reason Knight isn't the best blocker, or if you have the Crop Rotation and need a creature this turn, you can obviously do the Saga, draw step, main phase, second counter, create a token. And then it also speeds up your ability to gain something off it. So if you really want the Lava Spur Boots, or if you have something in the sideboard that you want to grab, like a Ghost Vacuum, then obviously the ability to speed that up is really nice. So a bit of a cool thing. Maze of Ith in this list as well, a little bit different to the previous one, which is great. Again, a little bit like Quick Reflexes, where it's great for keeping your opponent's creatures at bay, but also allowing you to attack and then maze your own creatures at the end of combat because they're still attacking creatures. So maze is always pretty sweet and just a nice way to keep something like a Barrogoyf or a Murktide at bay. So maze is always pretty nice. It does work well with Yavimaya as it's probably like a 0.25, 0.5 land when it comes to mana bases, but probably closer to that 0.25. The only other difference that I see in this list is we have gone down on the stages, kind of making room for that Saga, which makes sense. You don't want to target your colored mana and you want to be able to get the Saga in there. Stage as well is just great with Saga. I know there's a few judges on YouTube who have done kind of the interactions between Thespian Stage and Saga and how you can make Thespian Stage an Urza Saga, get it to 2, and then once it goes to 3, make it a forest before you have to sacrifice it, then you don't have to sacrifice it, and then it's just a forest, which is quite hard to interact with already, but it can also make constructs until the end of time. So that's pretty cool. I haven't probably got enough time in the metagame to realize what the Glacial Chasm is for, but it's obviously a great card against things that have like a big one swing, something like a natural order deck into Hoof. You can then Chasm to kind of do a massive fog. Same with Tabernacle. Tabernacle is, I think, pretty great, especially in a deck that only has a few creatures and a few ways to always pay for them in Forest and Savannah. So it is nice to see Tab in there. I know that Tab will jack the price of this deck up a lot. So I would say it is definitely not needed as much as it is in typical traditional lands, but it always is a nice card to have. And one thing I will say is Tabernacle is the type of card that it's very good to have a community within your legacy group, because you might have a player who has a tab that's happy to lend one out for an event. So always be wary of that. It's always a really nice part about our local scene, is that we do have a lot of players that like to lend out things, including expensive cards for events. Deafening Silence we see again. Ghost Vacuum I think is a great card because it has a nice bit of play against obviously blue-red with reanimate targets, but also Oops. Being able to just keep it there and potentially target Oracle is quite nice if they go for the Dread Return. They do, of course, have the Memory's Journey, but I think the Ghost Vacuum as well, just keeping your opponent off graveyards or things like DRC or Nethergoyf or Murktide, and then having that extra ability if it ever does come up is pretty sweet as well. Surgical, just another great way to play around Graveyard Hate and have multiple pieces, which I really like. We don't see Ferromacabre in this list, and a reason could be that there are no Once Upon a Times to dig for it. So Surgical, just being able to, take out like a Loam out of like from a lands deck, or obviously go after the blue-black decks with their reanimate targets, or potentially work your way into surgicaling something that's really hard to deal with. Just being able to surgical on the draw in your opponent's turn on turn 1 is huge, because obviously Extirpate takes a mana, Ghost Vacuum takes a mana. It's just really powerful to spend no mana on a spell, and Surgical is just one of those that, since New Phyrexia has been pretty great graveyard hate in most formats it's played in. Oof and Teague again, makes sense. Disrupt the Flute, a card I'm definitely becoming more of a fan of in just its flexibility and your ability to wait for your opponent to spend mana on something like a Planeswalker, and then just be able to put in the Flute, name it, and just turn it off. I think it's been pretty stellar, which is great. Get Lost is a 2 mana, 1 and a white instant, destroy target creature, enchantment, or Planeswalker. Its controller creates 2 map tokens. So pretty similar. I guess it's like a path. It costs an extra mana, but allows you to target enchantments or Planeswalkers, which is pretty cool. This is just another pretty good flexible removal spell for sideboards, which I've definitely tested out. So it's nice to see it here doing pretty well. An extra endurance going up to 3 post board for extra graveyard hate. Obviously great against Delver. Blocks and kills Tameo, which is pretty nice. And then Force of Vigor, another kind of force of will effect for green. So pretty nice to see. We also see Soul has been pretty similar lists. If you look at the numbers here, the prices don't change too much. Obviously that increase from 3 to 6 is mainly around that tab, but it's just, yeah, really nice to see that obviously these 2 decks have done well. In the Discord, we also have some other lists. This is one from Martin, who came back from a break and just did a nice 5-0, 10-0 with a list, which is very similar to the list that did well in the challenge, which is great to see. Obviously 4 copies of Force of Vigor was potentially not too great for these matches, but obviously just shows that they have a lot of respect for those decks. And then, yeah, another list that was just sent to me from Vector, who I believe went back-to-back in 1Ks, at least this list did. And this is where that splash can really work with a red splash for cards like Minsc and Boo. Here we have a main deck Morlock, which can get you out of some sticky situations with, like, say, Game 1 Magus of the Moon or Harbinger of the Seas. Really flexible if you draw it as well. Just being able to pump some mana into that X is pretty sweet. And then for the board, Pyroblast and Red Blasts. Probably the best reason to run red right now. You then run the Commercial District instead of the Lush Portigo, and then you obviously have access to a Taiga and a Plateau in some cases, but some players don't go for the Plateau because obviously it's not a green source, and you don't want to change up too much of the mana base that already works for green-white. So just really cool to see that green-white is doing well, and I think that a deck like Depths is a great deck to take to Eternal Weekend if you are someone who loves green-white strategies, because I think it has a lot of game. I think Crop Rotation right now is quite well positioned with cards like Paducah Bog being a pretty good hate piece for a lot of matchups. And then we also have a pretty fast win against some decks. You can just win on turn 3, turn 4. You can grind. You have a lot of flexibility in your lands, in crop rotation, in GreenSunsZenith, etc. So I think that I think we'll see. I'm going to say of the 3 top 8s, there will be at least 2 depths. I reckon there'll be at least 2. Probably in Europe and in America. I don't think there'll be one in Japan, but I'd love to see one. But hey, I hope you enjoyed this. I will be back, hopefully streaming depth pretty soon. I do love the deck, and I think it's, yeah, obviously pretty well positioned given these results. But if you are interested in the list, I do have a bit of an outdated primer on the GreenSunsZenith.com, but it does still have some basic information that is still relevant. And the Discord is great. There is a lands Discord that also allows you to talk within the green, white, and Naya section. So big shout out to this community because it's pretty great. That's it. Enjoy.